session for the convention.
Joe.
I feel like he's always out. Welcome, everyone, and good evening. I'm going to call the special study session to order in the council chambers this evening. And City Clerk, do we have a confirmation of a quorum?
Mayor Gilmore confirming a quorum.
And we do expect at least one more council member to attend. So I'm going to announce our study session. It's a presentation on the Santa Clara Convention Center operations. City Manager, Assistant Ruth.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So this afternoon we have for you the first of a series of study sessions related to the Santa Clara Convention Center. And so for today's presentation, we're going to provide you with some information, some context of the overall convention center. And it's a very complex topic which ebbs and flows with industries of entertainment and with office use, and there are issues related to facilities and operating models. So this is, as I said, a first of a multi-phase briefing. Today's objective is just to build a knowledge and a base level of understanding of the convention center operation today. So some of the topics that we'll be covering are industry trends on convention centers, situational analysis and the competitive conditioning of convention centers and of the Santa Clara Convention Center. We'll touch a little bit on the state of the current building and what the facility needs are. What are the current utilizations of the facility, including what is the business mix that we have in the building. And we'll talk a little bit about the current sales plan implementation. And then as we talk about future topics, we'll be seeking some policy direction and solutions. And again, we will be talking about it over a period of time. So some of the topic areas that I alluded to as a complex, woven discussion is one of the issues that we will talk about in the future is on the property of the convention center complex itself. As you know, that the land underneath the convention center complex is owned by the successor agency, and as the successor agency dissolves, the properties will go out for sale, and we'll need to talk about the future ownership and how all the properties work together and how that might impact the convention center. Another topic we'll talk about is the convention center building itself. So we'll touch a little bit about the condition of the building and what might be needed as far as to continue the operations. But that topic in and of itself will require additional information and more detail for the council to understand. So today we're going to talk about the operation. What is the current management of the facility and how are the operations in the facility? And then the last convention center topic, which we'll talk about over time, is the support operations. So what are the other business models that we'll be talking about? So like CVB, how do they support the current convention center operations? And what might be done or how we might look at that in the future? As you know, the city supports this general operation, and we provide a budget for it every year, and we'll be looking at that in the future. So with that, let me just start with a little bit of context of the overall management of the building. So we start with the contract in and of itself. In March of 1984, so it's been some time, the city approved a management agreement with the chamber for the management and operation in the center. And the fee was established historically at about $45,000 a year, but it was recently updated to 2% of the revenue, gross revenue that came into the building. In 1986, the convention center began to operate, and we've been using the same contract for its operation since that time. The convention center building is owned by the city of Santa Clara, and one of the key things to note here is that the convention center is a zero-based accounting business model. So that means that all the profits and all the losses from the center operation belong to the city. So I know that there are a lot of numbers on this slide, but one of the key points here is to take a look at, on the revenue side, Historically, the convention center was supported by the lease revenues from the Tech Mart and from the Hyatt. But as you know, that with the redevelopment dissolution, those lease revenues went away. So the overall revenue picture for the convention center complex has decreased. And, but we are still responsible for all the expenditures. And so if you look on an annual basis, putting aside just the operation of the building itself, we do have obligations for capital expenditures, for improvements to the building. There's the management fee. We pay for assessment districts. And so that the total expenditures have exceeded revenues over the last 10 years. And the cumulative total over the last 10 years is a little more than $10 million. And this continues to be an important point of discussion as we talk about the 10-year outlook in the future, what it looks like for our general fund and the other obligations and priorities that we may want to implement in the future. So just a little bit more about the 1984 management agreement. The duties of the chamber as the manager of the center has been to promote and advertise the convention center. They coordinate all the use that happens in the building. They book events, theater performances, conventions, and meetings. They schedule and administer the daily operations of services. So city staff doesn't respond if there's something broken in the facility. The convention center staff does that they work with all the meeting planners to make sure that their meetings run smoothly and effectively. They prepare an annual budget for the city's approval, and then they hire all the personnel necessary to operate the building. So the city's duties and responsibilities, the main thing is that we maintain financial responsibilities for operations and maintenance of the center. So again, that if the convention center performs well overall, all the revenues be flowed to the general fund, but to the extent that there are deficits associated with owning the convention center, then all those go to the general fund as well. We're responsible for the building, all the structural or significant improvements necessary, and we're responsible for parking and landscaping. So one of the key things to note here, talking about the 1984 management agreement, that it is dated, so it doesn't have all the modern features that one might expect from a newer contract. So what I mean by that is that over time we have not had metrics for performance, and so as we're starting to talk about the convention center and the future of the operations, we're gathering data on where we stand today so that we can start measuring that into the future and measuring the effectiveness of where we stand and looking at how we're progressing towards whatever our goal might be. The other issue with the overall convention center contract is that the management of the overall contract from the city staff perspective hasn't had a singular owner. That means that we haven't had an active contract administrator looking at things like metrics and the overall reinvestment back into the building from a strategic basis. And so that's one of the things that we would need to look at moving into the future. So taking a look at some of the recent history with the convention center, during the years following the dot-com bust and the Great Recession, again, the convention center operated at a loss. And in general, because all of these losses flowed to the general fund, we've made minimal capital expenditures in the maintenance of the building and its upkeep. We had one major expenditure, of course, which was the Mission City Ballroom, which really helped the revenues and the overall convention center itself. But on a day-to-day basis, we probably have not been reinvesting back into the building like we should have. And then during the period between 2011 and 2016, we were dealing with the redevelopment dissolution legislation and the ongoing litigation. And if you may recall, we were having detailed discussions about the future of the convention center and who might own what at the facility, whether it be the land or the building. And now that those issues have been settled, we can look more toward the future. About the same time, the city and the chamber began to discuss the possible termination of the management agreement. With the overall ownership kind of in flux, the city looked at whether or not that we should be looking at what the future might hold if in fact that we lost control of the overall convention center. So with that, in January 2017, we employed the services of JLL, Jones Lang LaSalle, and they started with a small contract to take a look and provide the city with some samples and examples of convention center operating models across the country. It was basically a research assignment. The results of that were presented to the Economic Development Committee, and then in February of 2017, and then to the full council. Soon after that, the council authorized increased work to the contract, which provided for the engagement of stakeholders and to assist the city in determining an operating model. And then the last phase of the contract was presumed to be to help the city with the procurement of the management entity to operate the convention center. However, after the stakeholder engagement process was concluded, we took a look at the overall picture and decided to redirect our efforts. To understand what kind of model we wanted to operate, we first needed to know what kind of facility we had, what operation we currently had, and really understand what do we aspire to be, what kind of convention center do we want to have. And so with that, we asked JL to take a look at the current marketplace and to provide us with data on the status of the existing convention center operation. So I'm going to turn over the presentation to Dan Fenton with Jones Lang LaSalle. He's an executive vice president and the global tourism director.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Fenton.
Thank you, council members, mayor, appreciate it. Here, I think as Ruth mentioned, as we go through this, I think the goal here is to certainly present information, but also make sure that as we go through it, if there's additional data or additional background that the council would like, that we either go over this today or make sure we get it for future discussions. So that as was mentioned, our goal today is to try to create a little foundation for how we think about our industry and as Ruth mentioned, where we see ourselves in the future. So let me start by, how do I do this? Oh, there we go. Let me start by showing you a couple of just overall industry trends. And here is a slide that really speaks to a couple of pieces. One is the growth in supply. If you go back and look at the blue line here in this graph, that represents supply growth essentially over the last 20 plus years. So you can see that other destinations and other areas continue to either invest in or expand essentially the convention center square footage or what they have. If you look at the lines below, those are two demand lines related to revenue as well as attendance. So you can see that there's an upward trend, but you can also see between the two lines that to some degree supply growth over the years almost outpaced demand. So one of the things that's an important takeaway from this slide is the fact that part of remaining competitive in the convention industry is to continue to think about how we want to evolve or what we think our future is in terms of continuing to if you will, stay with some of the trends that are going on in the overall industry. This slide here seems a little bit complicated, but really it's kind of a simplistic way to look at how the industry ebbs and flows with the economy. So those lines that you see on this slide represent net square feet, for example, the growth in net square footage usage, the amount of exhibit hall usage, the amount of overall revenue that was driven in the industry, and the right hand is the total attendance. So you can see how the industry ebbs and flows with the economy. So you look at 2009 to 2011, or that sort of time frame when we were going through that downturn, you can see how the industry responded. Interesting to note that between 2016 and 19, there's an association that does industry projections. They do project increased growth. And one of the things as we were looking at this, we realized that we want the council to take into account is there will always be ebbs and flows in terms of the overall kind of convention economy. And how do we think about that going forward, and how do we position ourselves to make sure that we're heading down a path that we want to head in terms of our competitiveness. So that's an interesting sort of way to look at this. If you look at the next slide here, what this shows is in some of the leading convention centers. And so these are larger buildings, but they really speak to trends. The gray areas that you see here are areas where those convention centers are either expanding or renovating current space. And what they're doing and what the big trend here is, and if you notice the use of the phrase multi-use expansion that's up there in the kind of gray portion of these bars, That indicates that what convention centers are doing now is they're not just expanding exhibit halls the same way they were before. They're looking at space now that is more flexible, it's more dynamic, that responds more to what the attendees are looking for today. So for example, in all of those that you see, again, all those sort of leading convention centers, that's what they're doing. The reason why this is important for today's discussion is as we think of our future and we think of the current building and where it's going, we need to think about how do we stay competitive in terms of what some of the space trends are. For example, we do a lot of research with meeting planners where we ask them questions about what are they looking for in sort of the space at a convention center, and their needs are different, and attendees sort of think differently. So the days of a room where there's a 6-foot classroom table and everybody's sitting around cramped in and they're watching a PowerPoint for 3 hours, what meeting planners are saying to us is they want something different. And they want the new attendee to have a different experience, and what this signifies is what other convention centers are doing to sort of respond to that market trend. So the question then becomes, how does that sort of come back to us? So what does it mean from Santa Clara's perspective? And we put a couple of things down here as sort of subsets, if you will, of some of the opportunities that exist that we need to think about here as part of our future. And if you look at the right-hand side, let's talk a little bit about strengths. So when it comes to our strength, one is geographic location. So being in the heart of Silicon Valley and where we are and all the sort of demand generation that goes on with the high-tech corporations and the things that happen here, that's an important strength of ours. Again, the proximity to high-growth industries, that's a strength there. Strong market demand. So if you look at all the economic projections that exist out there in our market, the economic positioning is strong. The question becomes, if you look at the opportunities, is are we in a position to capture essentially our share of that going forward? So if you look at the first question here about building condition and design, and we're going to talk about this more, but it is a clear opportunity that we have. And as everybody knows, and we're going to show you the details here, there have been a couple of different studies related to what the current needs of the convention center are, and I will tell you anecdotally that part of our process when it came to meeting with stakeholders that Ruth mentioned is we have met with and spoken to current users of our convention center and gotten their feedback for what we need to do as part of our competitive positioning, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. The whole issue of attendee expectations that we mentioned earlier, and the other thing is part of the dynamic related to continuing to be competitive, or if we deem we want to be competitive as a convention destination, is what are we doing to increase our destination appeal? So what does the attendee do when they're not at the conference? What are the things that we can do to continue to enhance that? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But these are things we've identified as early considerations when we think about what our future is from a convention industry standpoint. A couple of other market considerations that we've kind of jotted down here. We've mentioned this before, the growth opportunities. So you'll see in a second, we're going to show you the current utilization of the building, and you'll see there's opportunity for growth. So there's a frontier there when it comes to how we're going to grow our utilization. The market for our target sector is still growing. We talked about that earlier. The developments, i.e. City Place, the work that's being done at the Great America, all of those are things that are going to enhance our destination appeal, things that we need to think about. The continued investment in the hotel market, we've met with many of the hotel leaders throughout this process, and there is renovation investment. There's work going on to continue to have a competitive hotel product in our market. On that note, if you look at the next piece, one of the other considerations when it comes to the future is the fact that we will have sufficient hotel supply for bringing conventions into Santa Clara. So one of the wonderful dynamics we have is because of the economic growth in corporate transient business, so people coming in for individual business to do business in corporations, it creates a compression in the hotels where they're busy, which is, in a lot of ways, it's wonderful, generates tax revenue. We have to make sure as part of our future that there's room inventory available, and when it comes to the room inventory that is available for conventions, that we can target conventions that are a match, if you will, for our hotels. So when you think of the kind of rates that the hotels are commanding, we have to make sure that we are attracting conventions that are comfortable in that sort of rate area that essentially is compatible with the current hotel market. So that's an important consideration when we think about how we're going to position ourselves in the future. And to restate the fact that we need to always think about, from ourselves as a destination standpoint, how do we continue to improve and what type of investments do we need to keep making to make sure we're competitive sort of in the marketplace. Another piece that we wanted to share with you, as Ruth mentioned, is, I think you know this, but there was a building assessment done by a company called EMG, and they're a recognized firm when it comes to doing building assessments and looking at what is needed. And they broke the results of their findings into two key categories. One was short-term. So I think a lot of the council may have seen the report, but these are examples of some of the areas that they identified. So for example, when they said short-term, what they meant is, essentially, if we don't do something in the immediate term, we run the risk of major systems that will not function, that we'll have to replace on an emergency basis. Examples of HVAC, electrical systems, elevators. There's ADA issues that they raise that we need to make sure we take a look at. Exterior shell repairs. When they say primary parking needs, that's things like surfaces, things like that in parking lots. So they came up with a number of $5 million that they recommend, and as an immediate term as we can, that we make that investment. Because the risk is that, again, we have a large system breakdown or we have something occur in the building. So that's what they came up with from a short-term standpoint. And then what they also looked at is they said, okay, if we look at everything in the building and think about an entity, a company like this, what they're really looking at is replacement. So they're saying what needs to be replaced, what is in a condition that needs repair. They came up with roughly a $64 million number for that figure, which includes things like improving finishes in restrooms, making sure that carpets are essentially new and in good order, all those sort of things, wall coverings, finishes, other pieces that would basically replace the current things that we have in the building that need this. So $64 million was their estimate. And what we did in addition to that is we talked to some architects who are experts in the convention industry, and we talked to them a little bit about the notion of full renovation of a convention center. And we said to them, can you give us an idea on a per square foot basis of what it would take to do a comprehensive renovation of our center? So this goes beyond just replacing. This is looking at things like increased visibility of our walls, things like improving our public space so it's more conducive to some of the things that the meeting planners are looking for. And they came up with about a $265 per square foot number, or about an $80 million investment that would be needed to do a comprehensive renovation. So we wanted to show these two because these are two different sort of approaches to thinking about the future of the building. One is, let's replace everything sort of as is. The other is, if you did a more comprehensive renovation that really spoke to some of the trends we were talking about earlier in terms of what attendees are looking for, they estimated that around 79.5 or 80 million. Of course, that's today's number. There would obviously be escalators depending on at what point in time we were able to do that. A couple of things that came up when you think about renovation. We mentioned this earlier. But these are items that architects mentioned to us that, and we have seen with other convention centers that are some of these areas, improved technology, lighting. You talk about this multi-purpose space. One of the dynamics that are going on now in convention centers is creating spaces that can be used for both food and beverage functions, that can be used for exhibits, that could be used for meetings, all in one space. So there's lighting issues that come up there. There's opportunities there. Carpets, redoing ballrooms, bathrooms as opposed to just replacing finishes, all the things that you can see here that are part of really creating this competitive environment and really speaking to what we're hearing from meeting planners and attendees that they're looking for today. So this is a little chart we put together showing a couple things here. One, the combination of things that were raised through the building inspection. So $5 million short-term investment, $64 million to replace what we have for a total of $69 million. And the estimate that came from the expert architects of about $80 million when it comes to renovation. And we also put another number in there for you just as another piece, and that is sometimes people want to talk about new construction or potentially expansion. We've done work in this, also went back to those same architects, and that number that they have given us on a per square foot basis is roughly about $500 per square foot when it comes to expansion. So when you think about that, That's another data point to consider as part of thinking about our future. Couple of notes we make here. One, this does not include major parking improvements. And we may be stating the obvious on this one, but there isn't an immediate funding source here to support these that we know of. There may be one, but I don't think, Deanna, we're not aware of any that exist at the moment in terms of a current funding source. But that gives you a sense, and we may want to stop here just for a moment, because it gives you a sense of kind of what's the order of magnitude that it's going to take in an industry, in the convention industry, to really remain competitive or essentially become competitive going forward. You want to say something?
Well, and I just wanted to add, as we prepared for this PowerPoint presentation, the figures that you are seeing are not adjusted for any market escalation. So the more we wait, the higher these numbers will have to increase just due to normal construction cost escalation. I also just wanted to, when we got to this slide here, it was slide 21.
Hold on.
We thought that would be a good slide to pause at and just kind of express, how did we get here, right? Because clearly what we're showing are 10 years of general fund losses, right? That was slide 8. The absence, we talked a little bit about the absence of an internal contract administrator to keep note of the activity surrounding the convention center, as well as what I think has been really core to this is the absence also of a capital fund, where each year we would be contributing to a fund that allows for us to reinvest back. But if we look at, not wanting to play blame at all, but just looking at diagnosing what's happened, when we've had 10 years of general fund losses, it's very difficult to assemble funds to put into a capital fund that then allows for you to reinvest. So we thought this was a good slide to just put that context, because what's important is, as there is no funding source, the numbers will continue to go higher just with natural market escalation, which just means we are working against time.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
And there's other council questions as well, but the $79.5 million for the renovation,
Yes.
the like major renovation,
Yep.
Does that include any additional space?
No.
Any expansion space?
No, that contemplates the current building and doing all the things you talked about there.
And that's the $500 per square foot on the bottom if there is new construction and expansion.
Okay.
So it's
and
essentially just about double.
what is this, do you have the square footage of the convention center right now? Anybody know what
Gross
that
square
is?
footage,
It's a little over 300.
302,000 square feet. Gross square feet, 302,000.
302,000?
Yeah,
Not the parking lot,
correct, without the parking lot.
internal workings.
Right, so that contemplates work on the current building.
Okay, for the 80 somewhat.
That's right.
Almost $80 million. What about the parking structure? Did anybody look at the parking structure, or was there any assessment of the parking structure in terms of,
There was
I don't
an
even know what you could do to make it better, but.
There was an assessment of the parking structure, but we didn't include that in this particular presentation because we were focusing on the convention center, the building, and the operations in the building, and mostly on the operations in the building. We do plan to come back, talk a little bit further with more detail on the overall cost of any work that we might do in the convention center, as well as the costs associated with the parking structure. But for today's discussion, we wanted to lay the context. This context is really important as far as what kind of facility do we want to manage in the future. You know, how we manage a building that might be in a Class A tier might be totally different than a building that we might manage in a Class C tier. And so that understanding the context of where we stand and where we might aspire to be will also change the council maybe direction on the type of management model.
So I know this is just a piece of the puzzle of all the information that we're getting over this period of time, and I appreciate that. I just want to know, at the appropriate time when we do make a decision, I would like to have all the information, including the parking, because parking is an integral part of the convention center.
And in addition to what Ruth just said in terms of our purpose for today, it's also then to look at the performance, the current performance around the ability to obtain events and then the revenues associated with that, so that as you look at the issues, the financial issues around the convention center, you understand its ability to perform and attract events and how that feeds into the larger fiscal solution scenario.
So this will be a snapshot of what's happening right now?
Yes, we're going
Okay.
into that next.
Yeah,
Very
and one
good.
other piece, oh, sorry.
Councilmember Davis, I think, has a
Yeah,
question.
okay, so Ruth kind of touched on that. So we're looking at a business model that we haven't really upgraded since 1984, I guess. Is that how we're, is that, when you said business model, what, go ahead.
Well, I don't think, I don't know if I would characterize it as not upgrading since 1984, but certainly that we've managed the facility under the same contract since
Since
1984, yes.
Okay, so when you said business model, are we looking at projections of what's happened over the years and how we are where we are right now with this? Because this looks like huge deficits to me, and we haven't really changed the pro forma, I guess.
Well, we haven't, the contract dates back to 1984, and I think the best response to that question is the industry has changed a lot since 1984. Internally, we've not assigned an individual who actually manages the contract and brings forward metrics and data for the council to be aware of, so that if we have an opportunity to drive change in this area, we could certainly bring up policy decisions. And so we're doing that now. We're starting with some base information and recognizing that the contract itself is expressed in terms that are well over 30 years old, and in an industry that is changing very rapidly, as Dan has already showed through some of his charts.
Yeah, well, I saw with the ebbs and flows. So in an 8-year period when we had really good growth, we weren't bringing in the revenue to sustain the convention center? Is that kind of where that chart was?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that if we go back to slide 8, the years where we've had economic expansion in the city, what slide 8?
Sorry.
The years where we've had economic expansion, I think you have it in front of you, and we'll put it up on the screen. In the city, as the economy has continued to grow, and as we recover from the Great Recession, we show on the column the total impact to the general fund, so that it's, as we look going forward, the problems that we need to solve, we understand that even in a high economy, the contract structure still defaults back to the general fund, whether at a gain or at a loss. And it's important that as we look at our 10-year forecast and the deficit spending scenario that we're at, that we understand the relationships between the convention center as it impacts our general fund. And so we thought that was important to bring forward.
And I just wanted to draw your attention to the really crucial change in the business model which occurred in fiscal year 11-12, which you see the significant loss of revenue from rent, from no longer owning the land.
RDA.
That was the RDA demise. Okay. If you see, it went from, we were getting about $2.5 million a year into getting nothing. And that really puts a crimp into your business model, even when the economy
was doing well.
Does well.
Okay.
And Councilmember Davis, if I can add one other piece on the business model point, and that is, as you think about future metrics, there's a relationship to growing the convention business and actually the P&L of the convention center. So there are times where, as let's just assume, if we become more successful, let's say the renovation happens and we have more conventions, it actually may mean that there's actually a larger investment in it when it comes to the convention center, because it's a competitive marketplace in terms of attracting those conventions. So when we talk about business mix, there's a strategy around what's that right business mix that sort of combines the physical performance of the center and sort of the economic performance related to conventions.
Okay.
Councilmember Mahan.
Thank you. So, and I thank the city attorney for pointing that out, because I would have done the same thing. You know, when this was first conceived of, that ground rent was a big part of how to make the convention center work, and nobody could have foreseen the governor just taking that out, you know, and pulling the rug out from under us. So that's an issue that has to be addressed, to how if we can make that up somehow, and I think we're looking at strategies for that. But the other piece of that I'm not seeing here is, what is the hotel TOT, the TID, the Melrose revenues that the convention center generates? Because that was also part of, if you want to call it a business model, but that was part of the expectation, is that convention centers bring in that sort of business, which brings in that sort of tax revenue. And it may be time that if it's coming close, we may look at our TOT. We're one of the lowest in the county, if not the lowest. So there's some revenue opportunities there. So where is that piece in here? How does it flow into this model? That's one question I have. And then the other is, if we expand, will those revenues go up? Will we be able to attract more? And are these weekend revenues that otherwise these hotels would be unused?
Yeah, let me say a couple of things. One, I think to complete this analysis, you're correct. But we should add, if you kept going to the right, there would be a line around incremental, sort of looking at the incremental taxes that are driven and then what percentage of that flows back to the city. So I think that is sort of the next phase of that analysis.
And you're able to do that? You're able to parse out, those hotel nights that are a result of conventions and convention center activities?
We'll go back and dig a little bit. I think we can, but we'll work together on that to see if we can come back. But that's correct in terms of, if you think about when you book a big convention, part of how you analyze it is how much tax revenue is being generated, how much building revenue, and it's all part of the whole equation. So you're right, that would be the next part of that analysis.
Right.
We'd definitely be looking at.
And then do we also have the analysis, or can we get the analysis that shows how many of those roommates get booked through the CVB? Because that's another part of this, is the CVB there, as you see, is an expense to the city, but what is their role in attracting those roommates and getting those roommates, in Santa Clara, in our hotels? And I had one other question. I don't know if you can answer it now or bring it back to us, is how does a convention center our size, with our mix of business in cities of our size, compare with others? Because, and it's just my impression, but I think by and large, convention centers aren't moneymakers for city in and of themselves, but they are useful in generating these other kinds of revenues.
Yeah, let me go back to a couple of questions back. One is, we've been doing some work together with the Convention Visitors Bureau team and everyone to show you an example of some new metrics going forward. So this notion of showing things that we as a team are absolutely driving, we've done some work on that. We're going to show you. So I think that we can start to answer that even more going forward. Your point about other convention centers, it's correct that if you look at purely operational revenues and expenses, that for the most part, and I'm not saying every convention center, but probably 90+% have some sort of deficit. And you're right, it is sort of taken into account with what's the economic generation, and that's sort of how it's all looked at together.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that more as we move forward.
I just want to add, as we go into the next part of the presentation, we will see some hotel room nights based on past activity, as well as some of the metrics that have been provided by the convention center. And as Dan was saying, the connection between what our business room rate is from Monday through Thursday versus the going cost for the conventions, I think you honed in on something very important as we look at the amount of rooms that we're able to reserve for convention activity, as well as the rates that are attractive and how our hotels respond. Those two are very related as you look into the next set of slides. Okay.
So this is some work we've done together to do just a snapshot of utilization. So if you look at 2015, we've got 2 years that we're going to show you here. So you'll see that we have 422 total events that came to the convention center. 20% of those events had room nights attached to them. So essentially 85 events with room nights delivered 51,959 rooms. So just to stop there, Councilor Mayan, just to stop there, we could take that and go further and say, what was the tax generation, for example, off those room nights? So we can certainly do that as a follow-up. We had 3 citywide conventions. The definition of a citywide being that it uses multiple hotels. We have a general guideline that the team uses as about 600 rooms on peak, or when the night that they need the most number of rooms, it's about 600 is what we tend to say for a citywide. So there were 3 of those. So we averaged about 611 hotel room nights per room night generating event, if you will. So if you look at 2016, 16% of the events had room nights, which equates to about 70 events, 41,000 room nights, again, 3 citywide conventions, and 586 hotel rooms per room night generating events.
Slow.
One of the questions that has been asked, sort of as you were talking about other cities, and I want to be a little careful when I answer this because every destination is different. So to say something like, how many citywide conventions does one city do versus another, it's more of a data point, not that we are doing better or worse. But you can see in some of these other examples, they can range from 16 citywides to over 20. In some cities, they're over 40. And one of the things that we've done with the team is we've worked on looking at our building, and we've said, what's an optimized convention center actually look like? So what's that business mix when it comes to the conventions? And we'll show you a little bit about this in a second. But this gives you a little context of current activity, mix of business. The reason why this has several different layers of importance, one is, as city manager was mentioning, this question of how we see the future and the issue of the center's P&L and all the decisions we want to make. These are actually strategic decisions. And when we talk about the future of how we see our mix of business and what the implication is when it comes to P&L of the convention center and all the things we've mentioned earlier. So we'll talk about that as we go forward. This is a little bit of the type of business that is currently there. This is a combination, I think, of the 2 years. So you can see sort of our mix of meetings. These are sort of smaller meetings, conventions, those that function more like conventions, sporting events, trade shows, public shows, banquets. You can see a little bit about this. So if we were continuing down the path of talking strategically about the future, we might present to the council together a future business mix. So what do we sort of see the future? What are we aspiring to get to? Which would tie to the issues we mentioned earlier about building renovation and all the things that we need that are part of getting to this sort of future business mix. But this is where we are today. You look at the next slide, we make the comment that the building has been active with 471 events. This is over the 77 events that have hotel rooms, 3 events that on average are citywides, meaning they impact multiple hotels. The mix of all business, including non-room night generating events, are dominated still by the corporate sector. So even in the non-room night generating area, companies are using us to do things. High tech within the corporate sectors are the primary clientele, and associations and educational groups are other clientele that we see in the business mix. So if you think about it, one of the things that we've been working on is if we use the notion of large conventions as one metric of success, if we say as part of thinking about our future, and again, as we mentioned earlier, part of this is going to come with renovation and all the things that we talked about. But if this is a goal, we've talked internally about the goal of taking our current citywide business from 3 to 10 to 20. So one of the potential future business mixes would be to increase our citywide events in that sort of range. And by the way, a couple of key considerations there is that the hotel inventory is available for those conventions and that we are continuing to remain competitive. So part of the glide path here also sort of starts to think about how do we make sure that our convention center is competitive for these type of conventions. Some of the things we mentioned earlier. Anecdotally, we have had a chance to talk to building users ourselves. So these are people that have had experience with the convention center, and they give us thoughts like we've presented to you in terms of what they'd like to see in the future. So some of these renovation ideas that you saw, increased visibility, these are things that are coming from the users too. So real users of our building. So if you think about this, if one of our paths was we want to increase the number of large conventions, Councilmember Mann, to your point, that are driving the economic impact, that are driving all that, if we want to think about it, how do we do that? What does that look like? What we've done is we've worked together. I really want to talk about some exciting things that are going on today, and that is we've worked collaboratively on putting together a sales activity plan. So we are currently in conjunction with your sales team. We are working on how do we achieve that, and what type of things do we need to do to be able to get there. So there have been some very focused prospecting efforts that have gone on that we're going to show you here in a second. We've been meeting collectively to try to look at this. So as a way to validate, because part of this, all these questions is, well, how do we validate that there's a market there? So we can all sort of talk about this in theory, but how do we validate this? And we think the work that's going on with the sales team, where they are now increasing their efforts to talk directly to those users and understand what those users are looking for, as part of validating the market, as well as part of the sales activity to determine how we can achieve these potential future goals. They've also reported out to the TID hotels, who now receive monthly reports, which we're going to show you a sample of today, that relate to the metrics associated with driving large conventions into the convention center. So if you look at this right here, this is a sample report. We've now put out 2 of these. And what this report does is it speaks to the level of sales activity that is needed to be able to achieve over time growth in the large conventions. So we took it all the way back to, we worked with the team on what is it going to take in terms of sales activity to potentially get us there. And I want to put an asterisk with this to say that don't forget that this whole issue of the building renovation is really still part of all this, but this is looking at what kind of sales activity it's going to take. And what I mean by that is, we're assuming that we're going to convert the business at a certain level, and we've still got a convention center that we know needs to be more competitive. But just to show you this, we came up with a number collectively that we basically need 500 prospects. So we need to be actively engaged with 500 potential users on an ongoing basis to be able to achieve this sort of goal over time of getting to 10 to 15 large conventions per year. And you'll notice that right now, I think we sit around 30 prospects that we have. And again, this effort is new, so I don't want that to be, I don't want anybody to panic here. It's a new effort. And we've been able to add prospects, on a monthly basis. So our goal and what our team is working on is to continue to demonstrate growth in this area. And remember, this is different than groups booking. So this is the ability to add new prospects into our system that said they're interested. And the reason why this is important is because this will give us intelligence and give the council intelligence and what are people saying. So they're interested in Santa Clara, but what are the issues related to converting business going forward? So when you see lost business reports and things based on these prospects, they're really meaningful in terms of us determining our future. If you look at the next slide here, this speaks to after the group works on prospects, then the question becomes, how do we get them to a point where they're holding space and they've asked us for a proposal, which we call a tentative? So what do we need in terms of tentative activity? And you'll notice here that we need just below 59 or 60 tentatives. We need to have that at any one time in terms of our efforts to get to this goal. We are currently at about 13 or 14 tentatives that are in play, but we're working every day on trying to sort of build that. But you can see that, to the city manager's point earlier, this is an example of a metric that we see as part of the ongoing future, so that we can work collaboratively together to look at how are we progressing in terms of sales activity and how are we progressing ultimately in terms of booking conventions.
I wanted to take you back to the next slide, Dan, as we were preparing for this presentation. In a previous slide, we showed the amount of space available and then the amount of conventions that are being booked. And then we also talked about the competitive nature of this industry. What this chart also shows, and I know Dan has a lot to cover, is they're exactly matched almost, the prospects versus lost prospects, which means that we have to be very aggressive in order to get into the prospects column. So if it were lower, it means that the achievement rate of getting into a prospect status is much easier, but this is showing it's a 50-50.
Yeah, so for example, for us to get to netting 500 active process, we probably have to get 600 or 700 that we've been, or maybe more, maybe 1,000 that we've reached out to. So just so you know, the exciting thing about this, and again, if we had more time, the sales, Annette could come up and talk about this herself, but what's really exciting is each sales manager has specific targets that they are focused on to try to achieve this goal. So we're able to see that the specific sales activity, we're able to see what's working, what's not working, and kind of what they're gaining, what information they're gaining when they're out there, directly working on bringing new clients, into the fold. So that's a little bit, and the reason I bring this up is it's an example of the sort of the future metric. Ruth mentioned that the contract has been in place for a long time. These are examples of metrics that we see going forward, whatever the outcome is in terms of our approach, that these would be new metrics that would be placed into the future to be able to really look at not only performance, but really monitor how we're doing in the marketplace. This here is a example of a goal-setting process for definite business. So this is actually groups or citywide groups that would be booked. And you can see here that we've modeled an approach that said, what if over the next 5 years, our goal was to get to a point where we were convening 15 large conventions in our convention center on an annual basis. So that's the left hand. And if you look at the right hand, that's where we are today in terms of the numbers of groups that we have on the books. And again, remember, we've got tentatives that are in play, so there's hopefully more to come here in terms of converting. But this is a visual that we see also as part of the future in terms of being able to demonstrate sort of where we are and how we're making progress, so that the council or the stakeholders or anyone could take a look at not only how are we doing in this year, but how are we doing in future years in terms of being able to place those convention centers and put them on the books. Okay. So again, I just want to reiterate that this activity has been going on. A lot of great work on behalf of your team. So a lot of them are here, and they deserve recognition for really focusing in the last few months on this and trying to figure out how we can make progress here. And as you can see, it's starting, and we're excited about continuing to show the council this on a monthly basis, so you can start to get a sense of how we're doing and the success that we're having, as well as the TID hotels and everyone else. So I'm going to turn it back to Ruth, and then we'll talk about next steps.
Right, thank you, Dan. So again, today's presentation was to provide a background or a baseline for the council about convention center operations. And as we started to talk earlier, that the convention center issues, they're complex, and there's a many layering of issues. And so what we've laid out today is just a couple pieces of the overall puzzle, and we'll need to continue to lay out more pieces of the puzzle so that we can start asking for council's direction on priorities and investment levels that the council might be interested in. So some of the questions that we might be talking about, that we will be talking early in the future council sessions are, what are some of the assignment of priorities for funding that of the critical needs vis-a-vis other city funding projects, city needs? How do these priority assignments fit into our future vision of what we want the convention center to be? And for that matter, what is the future vision of the convention center? What kind of facility do we want to operate? What kind of facility do we want to have? And so to do that, though, we want to be responsive to the council and its questions. And I did note that we had a couple of questions asked by the council that we said that we would come back with, including parking structure numbers, what's been the TOT and sales tax benefit experience from the convention center operation, how much of that may have been generated by prospects directly related to the CVB, and what are some comparable benchmarks. And so we will continue to, we want to respond to any of the other questions that the council might have, and make sure to note down any other questions that we might not be able to answer today or that we would anticipate be part of a future study session.
Thank you. I have some questions. Councilmember Davis.
Mr. Fenton, okay, on one slide you mentioned the citywide conventions.
Yep.
Okay. And you said we would need 15 and we only have 3. Is there a reason for that? Could you elaborate on that? Or?
Well, I mean, we're really, to be honest with you, we're really looking at the future in terms of how do we get from where we are today to the future. So I think there's a couple of things that I would say that are part of this presentation. One, clearly the condition of the building. So there's a competitive piece here that relates to the competitiveness of the building that certainly factors into this,
okay,
that I think is part of it. And I think going forward, taking this approach that we're talking about, where it's really clear that the sales activity that's needed and all the things that are involved will really open up the opportunities to figure out how we can grow that number. So I don't have as much background on the past
okay.
Exactly, but I think
well, yeah, I just wanted to ask, how long have we been at that 3 level? I mean, that 3.
We can look at that question. The last couple of years, that's where we were, but
okay.
we can look at that.
Yeah, if you could look into that. And how realistic is it to get this 15 the way the operation is running right now? I mean, is it feasible to get to those numbers?
Well, I think there's a couple of pieces there, and I think part of this work will help us understand that. So that, for example, there's a lot that we didn't show you, but there's been work on looking at the universe of groups. So what's that universe that's out there that are sort of targets for us? There's work that we could come back and talk to you, show you that, as well as being able to demonstrate based on our sales activity, how are we converting? So are we converting from prospects to tentative to definites? That'll also start to give you an indication of, can we achieve this? And frankly, the other piece is this issue of investment in the building, and what is the potential for that over the next period of time? Because we don't want to downplay that that's an important piece of the puzzle too.
Huge.
Right.
Okay. And then for the sake of the public to frame and understand this issue that we have right here, how much does the city invest in the convention center and the chamber each year for the operations and marketing? So like, because it's our general fund money. So the people out there are wondering, because it is coming from general fund, how are we going to sustain this? I mean, how could you elaborate on that a little bit?
I don't know if we should go back to that,
Because there's no identifiable funding source. I keep hearing that.
Slide 8.
Okay, this is this slide,
So to respond to your question on this particular slide, which will be posted to the city's website after this meeting, we have the sources of revenue, which is the first column where it says convention center. Those are all the revenues generated by the operation of the convention center itself. The next column, lease revenue, as the city attorney mentioned, that was the lease revenue that we gained from the Hyatt and the Techmart leases, ground leases that were redevelopment agency leases that no longer exist. And then so that basically sums up the total revenues generated. On the expenditure side, the first column, it says convention center. That's for to actually operate the facility. So in order to get the revenue, we have to spend some money, whether it be staffing or other expenses on the upkeep of the building, costs that we have to actually implement any particular meeting or a show. And the next column is the annual contract we provide to the CVB. That's about $1.5 million. That contract is not only for marketing of the overall convention center, but its purpose is also to market on a citywide basis. The capital expenditure is the next column. That column is the investment of dollars into the convention center facility. And so you'll note that the investment has been what I would call fairly minimal over the last 10 years, given the size of the overall building and those things that probably needed to be taken care of over time. And we have, one of the things that was noted on a previous slide is one of the big needs is for a revamp of the heating and air conditioning and ventilation system, because a lot of that system is actually the original equipment that was put in the 1980s, and so we have not invested back into that. The next column on the expenditure side is relative to the management fee. So for a long time that fee was held flat. And so this fiscal year we've budgeted about $145,000 for the management of the overall convention center. It's about 2% of the revenues generated. The last column, it says maintenance district. That is the convention center share of the overall maintenance of the convention center complex. So the parking structure, the landscaping, all the parking grounds are shared facilities with the operators of the Hyatt and the Techmart. And so every year we bring back the maintenance district 183 for council review and a consideration. And we take a share of 40-something% share of the overall costs associated with maintenance and operation of the common area, and that's that last column.
Okay, and then I guess my last thing was, and Councilmember Mahan hit on that, how much are we getting back from TOT to handle this? I know that they basically ponied up to do a Melon Rouge to help pay off the stadium. So now it's like, how much money are we going to, because we're looking for revenue streams, and I want to grow that TOT this way. So I have major concerns.
I just want to answer your original question also one other way, and that is we put this sort of current business mix there, and one of the part two could be looking at this question of if you look at this vision and we say here's what we think we would like our future business mix to be. So here's sort of a number of conventions. We could take that and come up with what you're asking for, and that is okay. So what's the tax generation? What's the deficit? And what does that look like? So if we achieve all that, what does it look like? What will that deficit be, and also what will the tax generation be? So I think there's a way to answer that question going forward as part of the vision. The one thing that we've seen for most cases, if there is a focus on trying to grow the conventions, there typically is some, if you want to call it deficit, there's some investment that's needed to sort of keep the operations of the center going. That's just a general rule, but we can really show that, and that can be part of the future strategy. So this is those levers that you're kind of talking about, tax revenues, building revenue, those are all part of sort of determining what's that aspirational business mix going forward. Because as I think the city manager mentioned, for example, public shows and some of these may drive more revenue. And so we want to figure out what's that business mix that still maximizes room night generation, but does the best we can on the revenue side, and then what is the bottom line when we do that? I think we could come back with some models on that to sort of.
Okay,
And we can come back
you can-
to
all
with
right,
the extent
because this is
possible on
kinda-
a TOT analysis for try to go backward a little bit so that you have an understanding around TOT performance in that area.
If you can do that, that would be extremely helpful, because we are looking for the revenue stream. So I want to see where we were, how are we going, and if we don't have, we need to grow the city. I
It's
mean,
good
there's
base
obvious.
information to understand as you look at different models and the assumptions around hotel activity and TOT activity to understand how it moves the dial. So we'll establish some base information.
So you will come back with more information, and I just had you go over this,
Yep.
because I think that this is important information. I think that this should be website. You said you were going to put this up. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Councilmember Watanabe.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the report. Have you ever worked on a convention center where you've seen, an investment put into it to help turn it around?
Yep.
You have?
Yeah, and we've been involved with many clients who have, either renovated or made these kind of investments, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And it is usually predicated on a lot of what the council's talking about today, so it's predicated on this sort of projections going forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And you've seen an improvement as a result?
Absolutely.
That the investment was definitely, it generated the revenue, it generated the, interest,
Absolutely.
that the city was looking for.
Yep.
Are you looking at trends right now that, aside from, I think there's been like a regular source of bookings that have been coming into the city on a regular basis. Do you foresee, some maybe that we've not been able to target that would definitely be, that will come on board to Santa Clara as a result?
Well, a part of this effort that we talked about, this prospecting effort, is specifically to sort of validate that question. So what the sales team is doing is they're specifically looking at business that hasn't come here.
Okay, good.
So they're trying to, they're essentially working every week on trying to add sort of new prospects, because they've talked to users who haven't come to Santa Clara to say, here's what we're all about, here's what we can do for you. So I think we're going to have more data to answer that question, which is, to me, it's almost more powerful if it's real data that ties to real prospecting here. So I think we can continue to answer that question. But yeah, we're definitely looking at, can we bring new business, incremental business into the market?
Good. And just, and I think it would be good to know, who the lost prospects were, and,
Sure.
and what caused them to go elsewhere, and when they do go elsewhere, what was the reason
Absolutely.
for it? Yeah.
Yeah, and the good news is we have that, and we can report on that, and it really does tie to, that's the reason why when I was mentioning prospects, that we could have 1,000 prospects, but if we're not able to convert them, because there's reasons, whether it's the convention center or others, we need to talk about that and show that, be able to demonstrate that. So absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and then going back to the repeat bookings, I know from talking with Lisa in the past, I mean, there are some repeat customers that, you know, they come every year.
Sure.
I mean, I mean, are they still coming and,
Yeah, I think a big part of this strategy too is looking at what this optimal mix of business is. So for example, there could be customers that are annual customers that aren't actually a high priority, not that they're not wonderful, by the way, but that they're not necessarily producing the level of room nights that we're sort of achieving. So part of the strategic question is, where do we want to see that business mix going forward? And then how do we book the building sort of strategically so the highest priority business is sort of, you know, we go after that first, if you will.
okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Caserta.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I appreciated the report you gave tonight in our committee a while ago. A comment and then a question. I think there would not be the robust activity north of Bayshore if it wasn't for the convention center. So I think it creates, you know, a virtuous flow of activity, hotels, restaurants, spending, et cetera. Can you talk about a little, you know, there's a Team San Jose model out there. There's our model here. I always want to build consensus and labor peace.
Sure.
Can you give us some suggestions on that moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think, let me say this, and I think that's really going to be in part two more than today, but I will say this, that I'd make the statement that the governance model and the approach, let's say after the council says this is sort of where we want to head, and everybody's in agreement, it's vital to put together that model, if you will, or that approach that brings constituents together, that creates that collaboration that is needed. I mean, you think about hotels as one obvious example, and making sure that all the key industry partners are a part of the solution. So, I know it's a little vague, but I think that we can get more into that. But yes, there's a piece of that puzzle that absolutely is what that future sort of governance and what that collaboration looks like.
And then, you know, would you say our major competitor in conventioneering is San Jose's?
Not necessarily.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, you know, remember they're bigger than we are, so there's a size issue there.
That's right.
We could be going after the same customer, but a smaller meeting of that same customer. So I think there's overlap. I think one of the things that the sales team continues to learn is those clients that are really unique to Santa Clara. So there is our building's right for them. They want to be here. So I wouldn't want to say that, you know, that San Jose is sort of like the main competitor. I think they're certainly a competitor. But one of the goals of this whole activity is to really get to take a look at what's our universe, like what's Santa Clara's universe in terms of customers that we've identified.
And then the last question, this is an exciting opportunity for us. City staff, can you give us a timeline of when you think we're going to have the big ticket decision on this? Because some of us will be here just till December, so.
No rush.
Yeah. So, as we're looking at each other, but we have a couple of, as I mentioned earlier, we have a few more puzzle pieces to put on the table on maybe some other different discussions to do a deeper dive for more information for the council before you actually start making some big policy decisions. And the city manager looks like she wants to say something right here.
Let me, I just like to put a horizon report for you so that the science of how we want to move forward is very evident. The revenue opportunities that we want to bring forward to the council to explore will come in about the April-May timeframe. So we will start to have a deep dive into TOT. We'll probably want to do some TOT analysis before that so that the council can begin to consider for the November ballot issues around the swim center, the convention center, the general fund revenue opportunities and options that we have so that we can do some community research with respect to the tolerance level and what's the right package, if there is anything to bring forward in November. Separate from that, we'll be bringing forward in the next 3 to 4 months the operating models and putting together the data that has also been requested so that after we get through the budget, you will start to hear data around the models and what is more feasible as we start to bring the two together around revenue and operating models and any new data that comes our way. So I'm thinking realistically November timeframe, October timeframe around when you will be making big ticket decisions. By that time, you'll know revenue. We'll have a better sense of the budget and where we stand for the next year or two. And we'll have a better study around what the activity looks like and whether it's sufficient to look at drawing down on debt or how to create financial analysis to really invest in the convention center.
Brian?
And we'll need to do more work on the issues surrounding the ownership of the land. The land has to be sold, and until those issues are worked out, which we think we have something to possibly propose to you, but until those are finalized, you probably won't be able to make any real big ticket investment item decisions about what to do with the convention center.
Timeframe on that?
Well, the goal for selling the land is before July 1st, but you know, I can't guarantee you that we'll be able to work everything out by then.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Caserta, are you? Is that it? Okay. Councilmember Mahan.
Yeah, I did, and I'm not sure how this piece fits into it, but obviously there's going to be a huge related companies development there, very near our convention center, adjacent to it, as a matter of fact. And that will bring a lot of the kinds of attractions that conventioneers often look for, you know, shopping, theater, movies, whatever. Have we looked at what impact that will have on our convention center? And have we looked at, again, the connection between bringing conventioners in and increased sales tax at the adjacent facilities and so forth? That just kind of reminded me when Councilmember Caserta mentioned how the convention center sparked such economic activity north of Bayshore, and it did indeed. But that was 30 years ago, and now the landscape has changed a little bit. So what kind of, how do we quantify that?
Yeah, I think that there would be a way to look at sort of a spending model. Sort of, for example, what's the spending model today, and is there a way to look at what might that spending model be? So how might that increase, you know, what an attendee spends because there's more restaurants, there's more things available. So we have to think about that. But yeah, I think there's a way to look at that, because the answer is, as we talked about earlier, that the whole destination attractiveness piece, no question, it's a big part of the puzzle. And so that, you know, City Place is clearly going to be enhance our competitiveness. And so I think there could be a way to look at what's that delta of sort of current spending versus what the opportunity is.
So I'm excited because this also has a connection with an upcoming study session that we're going to be presenting either late March, April timeframe. And what's important about that is we have been asking some questions of related and regarding the City Place in terms of leasing strategy and what is their leasing strategy, as well as final development composition in terms of hotels, so that we understand how to build that into any scenario models that we'll be bringing forward. So I'm excited that this is starting to come together and the pieces as we bring them forward are starting to be connected.
Mahan, thank you. Just along those lines, I'm not sure our deferred maintenance of the convention center is going to wait for the City Place development, and I think some money and really tough decisions have to take place between now and then, so that the building and the parking structure and everything is actually still operating. So I know we're going to get information on the parking and the structure and the numbers, and I know a big piece of the puzzle is the ownership of the property, which is a huge piece of the puzzle. But in talking about the hotel room nights, and I know you're going to talk about that, so I know there's a way of looking in not just the room nights that were blocked, but the ones that were actually booked and used. And I know the hotels have that information.
Yep.
So when we look at, because for me, I would like to see the big picture of all the pieces together to give a snapshot of what is the economic impact. I know that since we, our new city manager is trying to get us to look at data-driven decisions. And so I'm trying to get some data to look at these, make these decisions.
Yeah.
And but I'd also want to know, I know that the TID also gives a fair amount of money for marketing, and I think it's $700,000 or $800,000 for marketing for the hotels. And could we get information on how that money's used and what the
Sure.
results are of that as well in the mix, because I know we didn't really talk about that in great detail. And let me see, I think that's it for now from my questions. And I have a couple of cards, so if there's no other, we'll go and then we'll wrap this up.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for the presentation. It's very helpful. So I have a couple of cards, and the first is Chris Boyd, and the second is Sarah McDermott. Like to come forward, please? Good evening.
Good evening, Mayor, members of the City Council. Appreciate the chance to be here, and thank you for that very informative presentation. I'm Chris Boyd. I'm the Senior Executive at Kaiser Permanente Santa Clara, and I'm here as both a representative of an employer that uses the property on an annual basis, but also as a board member of the Chamber. And I'm here tonight with many of my Chamber colleagues who are in support of what we do and what we would like to continue to do. A couple of comments. One is presenting that information about the expenses, and that looks pretty bleak. And so I think it's really important that we balance that with the TOT and all the things that were mentioned earlier. The second thing is the mention of the spark that this caused 30 years ago, and that we believe on the Chamber that we're very excited, because I think we're at that point where that spark is ready to happen again. And so that leads me to the third comment. Was there was one mention here that a couple of years ago we had indicated that from the Chamber that we were interested in talking about a termination of the agreement. At that time, it was a different Chamber. And for example, now I'm back on the Chamber. We have many of our hotels are represented on the Chamber. And we've done this specifically and strategically to be able to address some of these issues that we're discussing now with the convention center. We have the Hyatt, we have the Marriott, we have Biltmore and Mariani. They're all on the Chamber board, and they bring a wealth of experience that can help us go forward. Because we are very interested in, so take that off that slide again. We are very interested in continuing the relationship with managing the convention center. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Sarah, welcome.
Hi, Sarah McDermott. I'm a registered lobbyist in the city of Santa Clara for Unite Here Local 19, the Hospitality Workers Union. We represent the food and beverage workers at the convention center. And a lot of our members live and work in Santa Clara. Many of them are from Santa Clara. And this has been a great way that the city has promoted good quality jobs over the years. Our union also represents workers at Levi's Stadium and at Team San Jose, as well as our international union and our affiliates represent at convention centers around the country. And our business manager, Enrique Fernandez, is on the board of Team San Jose, and he says hi. He'll be here later tonight. So we want to make sure as this process goes forward that we are able to contribute. We feel we have a lot of expertise in this area, and we think we can work together to make sure that expansion comes with the expansion of good quality jobs. And I think that together we can make sure that happens. Because growth can be great. It can add more hours for workers. It can add more positions, and that can be wonderful. We just have to make sure that we are keeping workers in the forefront of this conversation. So we and the other unions in the convention center look forward to being a part of this process as it moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Please come forward. Or you can just leave it there and we'll pick it up. Good evening.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and council members. I don't think I need much of an introduction. I'm probably the longest serving general manager in Santa Clara. I also want to remind you that we also have some very important hotels as well. We have the Marriott and the Hyatt represented here tonight. I also represent the TID as the chairperson, and I know you've mentioned that. We're happy to give you some information on that. But I also want to say that the hotels have been part of the partnership of this city and the stakeholder we signed on to the Melrose. We have $30 million on the hook. And in order to get that, we need to fill our rooms. And I think you're very right to ask, what are the actual room sales and what do we want to do in the future? You've also made a good decision in having this analysis and getting people to speak to you that can talk about the industry and what the future looks like. I can sit here and I can stand here and talk to some council members that I've been here 20 years and I've seen 2 downturns in this valley. Downturns that meant that your TOT tax stood at 7 million. And Mayor Mahan was the one that had to balance that budget. And we only saved ourselves because of the reserves. We took those reserves and went through and did the stadium. We now need to look at the convention center. The benefit is, and I don't have to tell you this, is sales tax, TOT tax. We also have to pay our property tax, which doesn't come to you, but it goes to somewhere else.
Okay.
We also are the first people to offer employment to your teens and to your youth. We have a great college, Mission College, and we hire people into their first jobs and we teach them how to work. Sorry, my
Go
time's
ahead,
up.
you can finish. Go ahead.
We don't only serve high tech. We serve the universities, we serve the military, we serve the religious market here, we serve the sports market. There is potential for business. You will suffer if our TOT tax goes down. We are seeing occupancies decrease. You do need good management for this convention center. And this person here, with his studies, can bring the models together. Somebody mentioned expansion. Don't rule out the fact that we might need to go bigger. The footprint may need to go bigger to attract more business because we lose business. We start with the small conventions, we lose them to San Francisco, we lose them to San Jose. Don't make the mistake that San Jose did. They allowed that center to go to ruins. They let the bathrooms go down, the carpets were filthy, they lost business. We're in that position now. So the time frame is important. If you want information, these managers here and myself and the chamber will provide it. We want to be transparent. This is a big decision for the city. I've been in big decisions. I've knocked on doors for the stadium. The stadium came through, but it's a disappointment. And we've got to work with it and make it work. And we've got to make this work. Because we do provide jobs. There's not only the high-tech people that work in the city, there are people on minimum wage, and we provide a very good service for those people. So it is a big decision. We're here to help you. We want to make this work. You may need an interim management, which might include the model that you've got, but you also need to look at 10 years, 15 years further ahead. So I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Anyone else? Good evening.
Good evening. I'm sorry if this is duplicating some information that was be shown, but I didn't realize we were starting so early. There's a number of questions, and after having 30 plus years of experience doing event planning, I do know what I'm referring to. I'd like to know, in doing their research, have they done or are they going to do understanding and finding out from potential users what the barriers to booking are and what the barriers to rebooking have been. In other words, why are they not coming back to Santa Clara? I would consider us a tier 3 location because of our size and the attractions. There are some people that consider it a tier 2. I don't agree. I would like to know what is the plan for bringing those businesses in. You can't just say it. It's like when we remodeled the Franklin Mall. We said, oh, we'll redo it and look at all the business. Well, go look. Deardon Jr. did it, and it didn't make a damn bit of difference. So before we throw good money after bad, and I'm not saying the convention center is bad, we have to know what the whole plan is. Let's not do another piecemeal project. We have to have measurable deliverables in place that we know how are you going to attract. And I think part of that is including the stakeholders, but also including the big stakeholder, and that's the community. Because we are the city. You are hired by or voted in by the citizens. So I think as you continue to do these things, having community on those panels is just as important as having the chamber involved. You can get a lot of good input if you ask people. Too many times we're caught in this public bubble and you forget the private experience we have in our own city. So we need to start on everything we do in this city, leveraging that expertise.
Thank you, Debbie.
So I would like to know what those barriers have been and hopefully get those answers tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Please come forward.
Madam Mayor, Council, Joe Szynski, Chairman of the Board for the Santa Clara Chamber of Commerce, Convention Center, and Visitors Bureau. I just want to express the Chamber wants to help and work together with the city, the community, to make this a better place. So whatever we can do together, let's make it happen.
Thank you, Joe. Anyone else? All right. I think the barriers to booking are something that we talked about earlier today and will be included in the report. So we've heard a lot of information tonight about the convention center, and we're getting some really helpful information and data from our consultants and our city staff. We appreciate that. So tonight is just a study session, and we're not making any decisions, as was mentioned earlier, but we will use the information that we've received to evaluate the future decisions that we have to make, like what's the best model for our convention center, what's the best operating model for the center, and I think that's coming forward soon. What's the best governance model for the center? I think we'll be discussing that as well. So I want to thank the Chamber for sharing their perspective and their views on this with their representatives here. We appreciate that. We'll take everything into account when we look at the data and make our decisions on the convention center, which apparently will be sometime mid to later this year when we have all the information. And we're going to do what's best for the convention center, the businesses, and our city and our residents. So I think taking this approach is a good approach, and getting all the information so that we can make a good, educated decision on this is, involving everyone involved, including our residents. So thank you very much. Staff, do you have any closing comments on, I think you outlined our next steps already, as was asked by Councilmember
We'll be back
Caserta.
in about 3 or 4 months.
Okay. Thank you all. We're going to take a little break before our next council meeting that starts, I believe, at 7 p.m. Wait, do we have closed session?
Closed session?
No closed session.
Oh, okay, okay.
All right.
No,
We'll be
she
back
has
at
to-
7.
Yeah, sorry. She has to adjourn to closed session, and I was like, uh-oh. Are we adjourning? You did? You're getting good, Brian.
For us.
I don't really need this, right?